Welcome, folks. I'm Louis Joyner. I'm the chair of Indiana Modern, an affinity group of Indiana landmarks, and our charge is helping care for the modern rebuildings in Indiana. Before we get started on the introduction, I'd like to just remind you that Indiana Modern, we have an annual tour every year. Usually we do it in houses. This year we're doing it a little bit differently, and we're having it on the campus at Indiana University in Bloomington. It'll be this Saturday, starting at 12 o'clock. The sort of the beginning point is in the at the IAU Memorial Union. If you enter at the northeast corner at the hotel entrance, that's the kind of where you get your tickets, get your whatever orientation, and your little flyer and so forth. We have I think 6 buildings on the tour. Some of the really great buildings at IU, including IMP's Eskenazi Museum of Art, the new IMP, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe building near there, the Lilly Library by Eggers and Higgins with A.M. Strauss, who was a Fort Wayne architect, the Woodburn Hall, which we'll be hearing more about. Also by Eggers and Higgins and Strauss, and then Beck Chapel, which is not exactly a modern building. It's the little chapel next to the Union, and then Evans Woolens Musical Arts Center. So those are some really great buildings. So I hope you can join us for that. And moving on, it's my pleasure to introduce Henry Adams, the Ruth Coulter Reed Professor of Art History at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, as this year's keynote speaker for the Landmarks Mid-Century Modern Tour Series. Professor Adams has authored over 400 publications in the field of American art history, ranging in topics from Thomas Jefferson to Jackson Pollock. He's written multiple books on Thomas Hart Benton, specifically including Thomas Hart Benton, an American Original, Tom and Jack, The Intertwined Lives of Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock, and Thomas Hart Benton Discoveries and Interpretations. In 1989, in partnership with filmmaker Ken Burns, Professor Adams also produced a documentary on Benton, which was broadcast nationally on PBS to an audience of 20 million. With over 40 years of experience in art curation, higher education teaching, and art history scholarship, few others could better interpret and speak to the unique history of those rather controversial murals at IU. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Professor Henry Adams. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. After the formal part of my talk, we can have 15 minutes or so of questions, and then I've got a 4.5 minute film to show at the end of the questions. Thomas Hart Benton's Indiana mural was one of the most remarkable creations in the history of American art and remains as timely today as when it was completed nearly 90 years ago. In the course of the 1930s, Thomas Hart Benton created 4 remarkable murals which introduced a new approach to American mural painting in both their modern style and modern working class subject matter. The Indiana mural was the third of these, following murals for the New School for Social Research in New York and for the Whitney Museum of American Art, and coming a few years before Benton's mural for the state capitol of the state of Missouri. The Indiana mural was created for the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago of 1935. And in this period before the internet, World's Fairs were enormously important for introducing new products and new ideas. The Century of Progress exposition, for example, attracted an audience of 40 million people to Chicago, and it was the World's Fair that brought international modernism to America's heartland, and was also a memorable expression of hope for the future at a time when the country was in the depths of a long-lasting economic depression. From the technical standpoint, the Indiana mural was perhaps Benton's most astonishing technical feat. 14 feet long, high rather, and 250 feet long, about the length of a city block. It contains about 400 figures. Benton designed the project in just 4 months and painted the entire mural in just 60 days. Its artistic significance was noted in a letter from Benton's student Jackson Pollock, which he sent to his father, in which he stated, Benton has a huge job out in Indianapolis for one of the state buildings, 200 running feet, 12 feet high. The panels are to be exhibited at the Chicago World's Fair when finished in May. As I've already indicated, this is a bit of an understatement. The mural is actually 250 feet long and 14 feet high, a little larger than Jackson Pollock indicated. Pollock went on to state, after a lifetime struggle with the elements of everyday experience, Benton is beginning to be recognized as the foremost American painter today. He has lifted art from the stuffy studio into the world and happenings around him, which has a common meaning for the masses. Notably, all of Benton's murals were quite controversial, both because of their ungenteel subject matter and the directness with which they represented unflattering aspects of American life. In the Indiana panel, for example, he shows coal miners who are striking and a farmer who looks tired when he returned from a hard day of work. And in recent years, Benton's mural has become more controversial than ever because it contains a scene of the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, it's been seriously proposed that it should be painted over or destroyed. I'll return to this issue later on, but to set the matter in perspective, I'd like to start by saying a few words about Benton and his background. Who was Thomas Hart Benton? It's a rich and fascinating story. Thomas Hart Benton came from a noted Midwestern political family and was the grandnephew of Senator Thomas Hart Benton, who was the first senator from west of the Mississippi. A larger-than-life figure, Senator Benton killed several men in duels, nearly killed Andrew Jackson in a street brawl, and was a major advocate of Western expansion and the Transcontinental Railroad. The senator's daughter was Jessie Benton Fremont, who married Charles C. Fremont, the Western explorer, and through her writings turned Kit Carson and her husband into national heroes. Charles Fremont, as I've already stated, was a Western explorer, as well as the first anti-slavery candidate for the U.S. presidency. And finally, the artist's father, Thomas Hart Benton, Maecenas Benton, was a U.S. congressman for the state of Missouri and an enthusiastic supporter of William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement. The phenomenon of genius is always a little bit hard to explain, but it's notable that Thomas Hart Benton demonstrated talent from a very early age, as is demonstrated by this drawing he made in 1898 when he was 9 years old during a railroad stopover in Veneta, Oklahoma. It's so accurate that a Kansas City railroad expert, Harold Velroth, was able to identify the specific locomotive that he recorded, which was MKT engine number 32, which was a bit of an antique at the time, which may have been why it caught Thomas Hart Benton's eye. And in fact, it was scrapped only a few months after Benton made his drawing. What's striking and remarkable is the degree to which this childhood drawing presages the themes of Benton's mature work, such as his panel Instruments of Power, which introduced his first great mural, America Today, with the scene of a powerful locomotive charging forward. This is a mural that today is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But in fact, this seemingly easy and straightforward artistic progression was not at all straightforward at all, due in good part to the opposition of his father, who, despite somewhat ironically carrying the name of Maecenas, who was the famous Roman patron of the arts, felt that politics and law were the only suitable professions for Benton. To beat the art out of his son, M.E. Benton sent his son to the Western Military Academy, where Benton excelled in football but hated his schoolwork, and wrote regular letters home imploring his father to send him to art school. Already, Benton was clever at reaching a popular audience. And it's notable that he made drawings not in his letters, but on the envelope, clearly with the hope that the postman would see them and remark to his father and how skillful they were. In this sketch, you can see that he ingeniously worked the stamp on the envelope into a flag in his design. And hopefully the postman also remarked on the cleverness of this witty touch. Eventually, with the help of a sympathetic English teacher, Benton persuaded his father to send him to the Art Institute of Chicago. There he dressed like an artist, played up his artistic persona, and excelled in his classes. But there he also learned that the world's major art center was Paris, not Chicago. Consequently, he persuaded his father to send him on to Paris with the help of an inheritance he had received from one of his uncles. Benton first became interested in art through newspaper cartoons and book illustrations. And in this period, the Art Institute of Chicago was chiefly a school for commercial illustrators. Landing in Paris, where figures like Picasso and Matisse were changing the rules of art, was a very rude shock. Up to this time, Benton had supposed that the goal of art was to illustrate, to tell a story. In Paris, he was introduced to the notion that art shouldn't tell a story, but should engage in experiments with color and form. And over the next 10 years, both in Paris and New York, Benton ran through a whole number of modern styles. The record is a little incomplete because the Benton family home burned down in 1913. But we know that Benton ran through pointillism, Fauvism, synchronism, futurism, constructivism. And during this period, he was also estranged from his father, who he hadn't seen in 15 years at the time when he learned that his father was dying of throat cancer. Why is this not working? There we go. And he went back to Missouri to be by his bedside. The event marked a turning point in Benton's life. It marked the point where he suddenly felt the need to reconnect with the American life he had known as a child. And Benton later wrote, "I cannot honestly say what happened to me while I watched my father die and listened to the voices of his friends. But I know that when after his death I went back east, I was moved by a great desire to know more of the America which I had glimpsed in the suggestive words of his old cronies, who, seeing him at the end of his tether, had tried to jerk him back with reminiscent talk and suggestive anecdote. I was moved by a desire to pick up again the threads of my childhood. To my itch for going places was injected a thread of purpose, which, however slight as a far-reaching philosophy, was to make the next 10 years of my life a rich texture of varied experience." Over the next 6 years, Benton set off on a series of sketching trips. Well, this is not quite doing, here it goes. Through the Ozarks in 1916, and a much longer trip in 1918 when he was gone for more than 6 months and crossed the United States in an old Model T. During this trip, he covered every region of the United States, going down through West Virginia and the Smokies as far south as Georgia, and then west to the Mississippi, where he sketched the steamboats, and then on to New Mexico and Texas, and then back across the wheat fields of the Midwest. Back in New York, he sketched strippers and skyscrapers being built. During this period, he made hundreds of sketches, which provided the basis for a sizable mural he created in 1930 of America Today, which was originally made for the New School of Social Research in New York and is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The mural extends from floor to ceiling, contains hundreds of life-size figures, and completely surrounds the spectator, as you can see in this slide. So it's this kind of all-enveloping experience. Now, up to this time, American mural painting had been very genteel. Perhaps the most popular subject was that of a woman in a white dress who was holding some attribute that stood for truth, justice, art, virtue, or some other noble quality. Here's a mural by Kenyon Cox for the Minnesota State Capitol. These murals also sat back on the wall in a rather muted way. Benton here's Frank Millet painting a mural of this sort for the Chicago World's Fair. And Benton introduced a whole new approach, which was more modern in the use of form, with the dynamic handling of space, reminiscent of Cubism, and with scenes of modern life filled with working class Americans. All the scenes in the mural were based on what he had actually observed and had sketched during his travels around the United States. Though to fill in the anatomy more accurately, he had his friends pose for him. Here, the figure in the foreground of Steele on the left was posed by Jackson Pollock, while the black man with the drill in the panel to the right was posed for by another well-known American artist, Reginald Marsh. Benton's mural catapulted him to national attention, and his fame was clinched in 1934 when he was featured on the cover of Time magazine, the first time the magazine had ever placed an artist on the cover. Basically, at this point, he became as famous as a politician or a movie star. And for the next decade, he was probably the most famous and probably also the most controversial figure in American art. At this point, let's zero in on the Indiana mural. How did it come about? As I've mentioned, the mural was made for the Century of Progress exposition in Chicago, which attracted 40 million people. The main advocate for the Indiana's inclusion in the World's Fair was Richard Lieber, who was a progressive Republican in the Teddy Roosevelt vein, who was the mastermind and driving force behind Indiana's network of state parks, which is one of the best in the United States. Largely through Lieber's efforts, the state of Indiana set aside the money to create a large building in Chicago, which would contain a huge mural celebrating the history of the state. Unfortunately, however, after the money had been set aside for funding and the building had been constructed, the government committee in charge of deciding who was going to do the mural had fallen into deadlock. And at the point when there was only 6 months until the opening of the fair, they still had not decided on who the artist of the mural would be. And while they wanted to give the commission to an Indiana artist, there was no artist in Indiana who had the skill or experience to produce a mural so large in such a short time. Thomas Hart Benton learned of the project through a friend of his, Thomas Hibben, who was originally from Indiana, but was then working as an architect in New York. With 2 large murals to his credit, Benton was one of the few American painters with the experience necessary to take on such a large project, particularly one that had to be produced in such a short time. Predictably, when it was announced that Benton had been chosen for the project, it stirred up controversy in Indiana based on the notion that it should have been awarded to an Indiana painter. In fact, there was no painter in Indiana who would have been able to produce a mural so quickly. And significantly, the choice of Benton was welcomed by the person who was probably the most notable painter in Indiana at that time, William Forsythe, who was then the last living member of the Hoosier group, who produced Indiana landscape scenes in an impressionist style. In fact, Forsythe's daughter, Constance, became one of Benton's assistants and helped enlarge his notebook-sized drawings, first to large-scale mural cartoon on paper, and then again to the final 14-foot panel, which was 4 times the size of the cartoon. Benton had just 6 months to produce a mural 14 feet high in the length of the city block. To accomplish the task, he spent 4 months on the design stage and then painted the mural in just 60 days, which is a task equivalent to producing an easel painting 6 by 12 feet in size and producing 1 a day for 60 days in a row. Benton's design process was remarkably thorough. Basically, let's have the next slide. Fairly early after reading, his first step was to read about the history of Indiana and to decide to divide the history of the state into cultural history and industrial history. And then he produced compositional sketches and sketches based on travel around the state. He created a clay model of the composition. He made color and grisaille, that's black and white studies of the clay model, further figure studies and creation of the quarter-size cartoon, and then transfer of the cartoon to make the full-size outline drawing on the mural panels. Basically, early on, he was given an abandoned beer hall in Indiana as the location for his work. Each of these steps involved complicated issues, and also we don't have a complete record of what Benton did. We know that in the first 4 months, he made about 600 or 700 drawings. We have about 100 of those, which we can now identify, and fewer of the color compositional sketches. To start with, Benton made sketchbook-sized drawings of 2 types for the composition, 2 types. One of these was compositional drawings, and I think what's surprising is how abstract his initial concept of the composition is. He's really thinking about abstract forms, and then he transforms that into a pattern with stick figures. During the first few months, next slide, Benton also traveled around the state of Indiana. And some of the drawings represent Indiana landmarks, such as this drawing of the sawmill in Sawmill State Park. but most of his drawings, the next, are figure studies. These are studies that are probably done in Indianapolis from posed models. And kind of the next slide. And he also traveled around this state making both figure studies and next slide, most often portrait studies where he's basically sketching the head and knows that he can figure out the pose of the figure later. Kind of the next one. Sometimes rather wonderful portrait sketches. And I think it's interesting how economical they are. He's not bothering with shading or creating a photographic effect, but is concentrating on the bare bones of the mural. Let me say a word about the compositional sketches. Basically, having made the travel sketches, he needed to work them into a composition. And here his approach grew out of his involvement with various forms of modern art, both in Paris and New York. Next slide. In every decade of his career, interestingly, while he's known as a realist, Benton also produced purely abstract paintings, such as the one on the left, which bears an obvious relationship to an early work by his pupil Jackson Pollock on the right. The idea behind these abstract paintings was to develop a system where your eye can fall on any part of the painting and it will be led in a kind of sinuous movement that goes both on the surface and in depth, and eventually brings you back to the starting point, but then suggests other pathways for your eye to follow. Next. Indeed, in 1926 and 1927, Benton wrote a series of 5 articles in Arts Magazine which explore the principles of abstract painting. Next. These diagrams, as you can see, provided the basis for the famous strip paintings of Jackson Pollock. Next slide. And what's interesting, this is a diagram made by someone else of the basic rhythm of the Indiana mural, but you can see that Benton is thinking of it, the composition, very much in terms of patterns of rhythmic movement. Next slide. As a young modernist in Paris and New York, Benton was particularly influenced by a style known as synchronism, which was developed by his closest friend in these years, a California painter, Stanton MacDonald Wright. Synchronism was based on the idea of combining cubism with modern color theory to break down the sculpture of figures like Michelangelo into dynamic patterns of color and spiraling movement into space. And here you can see how it was a style that lent itself both to pure abstraction and to paintings that are clearly based on the sculpture of Michelangelo, but portrayed as if they were carved out of rainbows. The synchronists, next slide, based their paintings on the sculptural rhythms of a single figure, but Benton became interested in extending this pattern of twisting rhythmic energy to complex figural compositions, as you can see in these examples. In the lower left is a drawing he made alongside Stanton MacDonald Wright. Up above is an early figure composition with 3 figures, with about 6 figures, and with about 12 figures. And that's their chronological progression, so that you can see that he's working to develop more and more complex forms of rhythmic movement. Next slide. Because of his desire to create a sort of rhythmic organization of form, interestingly, Benton designed his paintings and murals in quite an unusual way. After collecting life drawings and making some rough sketches of the overall composition, He developed the final composition by making a clay model of the design. Unfortunately, none of Benton's clay models of the 1930s survive, though we know some of them from photographs. And at the upper right, you can see his clay model for a painting of 1939 Persephone. He then made a rough color study and then did further study drawings of anatomy and details as the basis for the final composition. Next slide. Creating clay models of this sort sounds like a crazy amount of work to put into the design of a painting, but in fact, large mural paintings present an unusual problem for an artist. When you're painting close up, you can't see what the painting will look like from 20 or 30 feet away. And Benton's careful preparations with clay models and with studies both in black and white and in color gave him an extraordinary grasp of how to fit the different sections of the mural together to create a unified composition. While he surely occasionally stepped back 20 feet to gauge the effect, for the most part, even when working close up, he was able to understand how the different parts of the composition fit together. And unfortunately, next slide, none of Benton's murals for the Indiana mural survive, though we have the grainy photograph of one of them, which was reproduced in an Indianapolis newspaper. Benton seems to have used plasticine clay, and with the Indiana mural, he seems to have made a clay model of each panel and then worked out the design of that panel, then smashed up the clay model and made another one for the next scene that he was representing. Kind of the next slide. Once Benton had fabricated the clay model, the next step was to enlarge his studies into a cartoon, a quarter the size of the final mural. And then again, to transfer the cartoon onto the wall panels, which weighed a ton apiece and were 4 times as large. In the case of the Indiana mural, we're fortunate that 2 of Benton's working cartoons survive. To my knowledge, they're the only working cartoons for any of his murals to the 1930s. One is a study for the panel of colleges and city life, which is in the University of Missouri Art Museum. Comes the next one. I'm the lucky owner of another cartoon for the panel of leisure and literature. And it's not easy to make it out in this slide, but if you study the actual cartoon, you can see the underdrawing that was done by Benton's assistant, Constance Forsyth, and then he went over it with a darker pencil, basically clarifying the arrangement of shapes and also creating sort of more dramatic edges to the anatomy. And the final step, that's the next slide, is painting the mural. As you can see, you need to know exactly where you are because you're not stepping back to look at it. And then next slide, finally moving the panels to the Century of Progress exposition and later to the University of Indiana was a major challenge, partly because they were heavy and required heavy lifting equipment, but they were also too tall to fit under many of the highway bridges. So the final route took a zigzagging route to the World's Fair and eventually required taking down a college gateway at the University of Chicago to get the murals to the fair. Next slide. In the development of his composition, I've mentioned Benton's abstract paintings and his writings on abstract composition, but interestingly, there's another source for his sense of how to organize large groups of figures. During the teens of the 20th century, Benton worked as a set designer for the silent film director Rex Ingram, who's best known for his film The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which was the movie that turned Rudolph Valentino into a star. Next slide. Ingram began his career as a painter and sculptor, and he was a master at organizing actors and scenes of crowds in flowing schemes of diagonal movement into space. Have the next slide. You can see that Benton is basically using Rex Ingram's technique of a sort of diagonal cluster of figures that's going in and out in a consistent rhythm. Next slide. So far, I've discussed Benton's language of artistic form, but Benton was also an innovator in his approach to American history. And while he liked to play up his image as a sort of hillbilly and yokel, in fact, Benton was extremely well read. In the classics of Latin and Greek, in French literature, in American and in English literature, in art history, in subjects such as weather and botany that related to his paintings, and above all in history and politics. And let's not forget that Benton was the son of a US congressman and drank in history and politics and political argument almost as early as his mother's milk. During his early years in New York, that is during the period when he worked on the Indiana mural, Benton's ties with the world of New York intellectuals came largely through a remarkable educator, Carolyn Pratt, who was essentially a follower of John Dewey's progressive theories of education. She serves as the head of a progressive city and country school, which is still in existence, where Benton's son was enrolled, and she had many ties with Columbia University and the world of radical New York intellectuals. And in fact, when Columbia fired various people for being too leftist, she hired them to teach at her school. Next slide. At this point, American history was moving away from the sentimental patriotism of figures like Parson Weems and George Bancroft, and was shifting away from being a narrative of the lives of a few great men to investigating large-scale demographic and cultural trends embodied by the American people as a whole, and confronting such issues as class and economic conflict, racial discrimination, and the regional and cultural and economic diversity of the United States. Benton was particularly influenced by the historian Leo Huberman on the left, who taught at the City and Country School, and he was friendly with figures such as the historian and social critic Charles Beard, as well as with Lewis Mumford. Next slide. Indeed, in 1933, the same year as the Indiana mural, Benton provided illustrations for Leo Huberman's book, We the People, which is essentially a Marxist history of the United States, though one which still makes very informative reading. Next slide. It's amusing that many art historians, without bothering to look at the actual work, have accused Benton of a sentimentalized, idealized view of America. His Missouri mural, for example, starts off with a fur trader selling whiskey to an Indian. Next. It includes scenes of slaves being whipped, Jesse James robbing a train. As Benton said, he started an important line of business in the United States. And Frankie and Johnny engaging in a shootout in the St. Louis saloon. It closes with the scene of Kansas City's notorious political boss, Tom Pendergast, who's sitting in a nightclub with two of the trustees of the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. With regard to the Indiana mural, I think what's remarkable is how quickly Benton moved from a general knowledge of the American frontier to detailed episodes of Indiana history and was able to render these episodes with remarkable accuracy to historical costumes and geographical settings, and also making use of faces that were drawn from actual people who lived in Indiana. And just to give you a sense of the sweep of it, the mound builders he drew on recent archaeological excavations to get the jars and jewelry and so forth accurate. French missionaries with an accurate representation of their first church at Vincennes. Frontier life, which covers the Cordon Convention. Early schools, which includes Abraham Lincoln and Father Rapp's Utopian Community in New Harmony. And then moving on, a contemporary farmer, next, contemporary industry, next, and finally, the panel of General McNutt, which sadly has disappeared, and also things like the Indianapolis 500, basketball, strikers, a lady putting on lipstick, and so forth. Now, next slide. One of Benton's most remarkable moves in creating this mural was to include a representation of the Ku Klux Klan burning a cross in his panel of the Klan, the parks, the circus, and the press. Interestingly, so far as I'm aware, this didn't create much stir at the time, although it has stirred up a good deal of controversy recently. Most of the contemporary controversy was focused on the fact that Benton didn't live in the state of Indiana. The reasons for the silence about the Klan panel are interesting to speculate. It may have been because the scene was put in the background as just a small incident in the mural and was hard to make out. But my guess is that also the Klan was a subject that everyone in Indiana at that time preferred not to discuss. And Benton was also more politically astute than he's generally given credit for. It didn't hurt that he included a portrait of Richard Lieber in the foreground at the lower right, who was a revered figure in the state. And it would be clear that anyone who disapproved of the painting would have to take on not only Benton, but Richard Lieber. As you know, this panel has stirred up a good deal of controversy recently. To put this controversy in perspective, it's interesting. It's necessary to know something of the Klan in Indiana and the politics of the state at the time Benton made his mural. And I must confess that before I encountered Benton's mural, I thought of the Klan as a phenomenon of southern states such as Alabama and Mississippi, rather than of Indiana in the heart of the Midwest. But at the height of its power in the 1920s, close to 25% of the white population of Indiana belonged to the Klan. Next slide. They had cross burning ceremonies. Next, like many evil things, it was clothed in Christian respectability and piety. Here are some pious Klan ladies in Muncie, Indiana. Next, and it essentially controlled the politics of the state. Well, I guess we'll get to Edward Jackson later, but it controlled the governor and the two senators and about half the legislature. And the mastermind behind this phenomenon was a remarkably sinister and manipulative individual, George Stephenson, who recruited about 2,000 new members a week for the Klan until he reached a grand total of about 250,000. Due to the entry fees and annual fees, for Stephenson, leadership of the Klan provided a means to achieve not only political power, but enormous wealth. Joining the Klan required a membership fee of $40 a year, of which Stephenson pocketed $10. So Klan leadership made him a multi-millionaire, provided him with a sort of private army to go around and strong-arm people through beatings, house burnings, and other unsavory tactics, and it also provided a sizable sum with which to bribe members of the legislature. This is the governor of Indiana, who was supported by the Klan. And next slide. Resistance to the Klan was clearly dangerous, but was a cause embraced by the Indianapolis Times, which won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage of the Klan in 1924. Next slide. Indianapolis Star also stood up against the Klan. And next slide. I think we still don't have a full understanding of the operations and activities of the Klan in Indiana, but its collapse came about very abruptly in 1924 when Stevenson abducted and raped a 28-year-old employee of the Indiana School Department, Madge Oberholzer, who had been working for him as a sort of errand girl and assistant. Madge then committed suicide by drinking poison, but managed before her death to provide a full signed account of what had happened to the police. Stevenson was put on trial and sentenced to life in prison in 1925. Interestingly, his house was burned down the day of his arrest, although we don't know who did it. He was denied a pardon by the governor. And so in 1927, he started talking with reporters for the Indianapolis Times and released a list of elected and other officials who had been in the pay of the Klan. This led to a wave of indictments in Indiana, more national scandals, the rapid loss of tens of thousands of members of the Klan, and basically brought the Klan to an end. Stevenson lived on to 1966, dying in prison 30 years after first being sentenced. Next slide. It was clearly gutsy of Benton to include the Klan in his mural of the history of Indiana. And while Stevenson's conviction had occurred 8 years before, many prominent figures still active in the state had been tarnished by the subsequent unveiling of the Klan's activities. To get away with representing the Klan, Benton pushed the scene in the background. And like many of the scenes in Benton's mural, the scene is built around choices and contrasts. In the foreground on the left, we have the reporters and a pressman of the Indianapolis Times, who are the people who broke the Klan. Then we have a little black girl in bed getting free hospital care from a nurse, which is the sort of good deed that the Klan was trying to suppress. And then on the right, we have Richard Lieber, the Parks Commissioner of Indiana, planting a tree. There's then a wall which separates this world of good deeds from the background, where the Klan is burning a cross, and which is also populated by a circus master and a dancer, a horse, and a fire that firemen are struggling to put out. Here, Benton's message is a bit more difficult to make out. And in fact, I think he's encouraging us to make rather free associations. But essentially, it seems as though he's suggesting that the Klan is a ridiculous circus. What about the horse? It seems as though it separates the realm of thought and decency from the realm of animal instinct. And I think one of the things that makes this mural so interesting is that it's not always entirely easy to figure out what's going on or what to make of it. Essentially, Benton is encouraging us to look closely, and I think he's also inviting us to come up with interpretations. Recently, there were nearly 1,600 signatures for a petition arguing that this mural should either be removed or whitewashed or destroyed. Have the next slide. That's when I wrote a piece in a website called The Conversation, which was later reprinted in Smithsonian Magazine, basically saying that I thought the mural should be kept as a reminder of some of the dark spots in the history of the state of Indiana, or indeed of America as a whole. And I've passed out a copy of this to you along with, can the next slide? Jessie Benton, the artist's daughter, wrote a rather moving statement in defense of the mural, basically saying that her father was trying to make a statement against racial discrimination, and it's called "My Father Painted the Truth." Next slide. And she talks about growing up in Kansas City in a world which was largely segregated, but not in the Benton home, where people of all colors and persuasions were welcome. I should note, next slide. Here's Jessie Benton, who sadly died earlier this year, and she was a wonderful connection with the world of Thomas Hart Benton, kept coming up with things I didn't know about her father. But next slide. The scene is actually full of things that are controversial and unpleasant. If you bother to look carefully at the mural, here's a scene of industrial progress where it's celebrating the railroad train, the barges, the steamboat. But if you look in the background, Native Americans are being forced off their land, so that Benton is asking us to think about the ways in which what we like to call progress often has a dark aspect. Have the next slide. Here's Abraham Lincoln, who's standing in front of a poster for a runaway slave. Next slide. Here is a scene of coal, gas, oil, and brick, basically based on the area around Terre Haute. But if you look in the background, well, on the left, there is a strike meeting, and on the right background, there's a striker throwing a rock at a guard. And next slide. I'm actually not sure the exact state of things at the moment, but I think it's sad that so many students at the University of Indiana wanted the painting to be removed. But I also think it's impressive that nearly a century after Benton made his painting, his paintings are still as controversial and timely as ever. Can the next slide? Next slide. I'm not where I think I should be, but try the next. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's Peter Lewis, the CEO of Progressive, but good art starts fights in bars. It seems to me art has many functions in society, but one is to bring people of different approaches together in conversation and to get them to talk about things. Yeah, and I think that if you look around at the world today, it's full of crazy things, just as it was in Benton's time. So that I won't end on a sour note, I should also remark that along with being full of social criticism, Benton's mural is full of invitations to learn more about the remarkable figures in Indiana history. There are figures like the Hoosier landscape painter William Forsythe, the architect Thomas Hibben, the conservationist Richard Lieber, and not in the mural, but next slide, let's not forget Herman B. Wells, the president of the University of Indiana, who's a kind of fascinating figure. He initially intended to become a banker and was clearly comfortable sitting down with fat cat businessmen. but he was also a forceful advocate for civil rights, and he was a forceful defender of innovative but controversial scholarship, such as the Kinsey Report, and a master of getting seemingly goofy but foresighted notions through the state legislature, such as to create a Department of Folklore at the University of Indiana. Come to the next slide. And finally, the final slide. Basically, without Herman Wells, we wouldn't have the Indiana mural today. So I think that's something to celebrate. So I don't know if any of you have questions. I think we can spend, and feel free to leave at this point if you'd like to. I know I've gone on the long side. Yeah.
With the panels or the scenes there, or did he always just want to leave that up to the viewer to see?
Industrial progress panel, where it's not saying industrial progress is bad, but instead we should also take it as bad consequences. Benton was particularly after his Missouri mural.
You answered that question after.
Okay.
Just for the people on Zoom.
Yeah. After his Missouri mural, Benton went through a particularly intense popular grilling. And at one point, someone asked him if he loved the state of Missouri, and he said, "It interests me." Any other questions?
The installation at IU now has kind of necessarily broken this up into,
Right.
and it's not installed as it wasn't originally. Is it still, I mean,
It's pretty close to the way it was originally, but there are two panels that are in a separate classroom, one of which is the Klan panel that is so controversial. There's also one panel that's missing, so that you get the general effect, but it's not precisely the same as in its original location. At the Century of Progress exposition, it was presented very high up, as it is now at the University of Indiana. I think it's too bad that it couldn't be moved to a place where you could get closer to it, because there's an enormous amount of detail in Benton's rendering of the state. And when it's high up, you sort of crane your neck trying to make all of that out.
Was the space in the auditorium, in the lobby of the auditorium, where most of it's installed, designed for it, or was that just fortuitous?
I think that the building was pretty well designed, and that the mural was a last minute addition to the building, so that it somewhat fit, but didn't perfectly fit. Yeah.
How many assistants and painters he had on staff, and also where was the space that it was done in?
It was painted in the Germania Beer Hall, which was an abandoned beer hall in Indianapolis, which has since been knocked down. Benton did have assistance for enlarging his drawings from his initial sketches. And the cartoons that I showed you, he basically had an assistant enlarged them, and then he went over and corrected the drawing. He did all the painting himself. So he had no help with the painting, which is really rather astonishing. And I think that most of the assistants, he wasn't having people design any part of the mural. He was having them do the mechanical work of enlargement. Yeah.
Where are they located? Are they at IU as well, or are they just sort of scattered about?
IU has a lot of them. They have about 100, which are mostly small size drawings that Benton made around the state or compositional studies. A couple of the research drawings, I think he gave to the people who he represented. And just for example, the drawing of Richard Lieber, no one knows where that is now. There's an early newspaper photograph, but he probably gave that to Richard Lieber. The color sketches aren't very well documented, and they seem to turn up occasionally. There's a very good catalog by Kathy Foster and Nan Brewer that was done by the museum at the University of Indiana, which reproduces most of the little sketches. And one of the neat things is most of them Benton jotted down where they were done and who the model was, so that someone who wanted to do research could figure out exactly who this person was who's represented in the mural.
We have a question from a Zoom viewer. They'd like to know when the murals were actually installed at IU. They understand that the murals were housed at the Indiana State Fair for years prior to going to IU.
Yeah, anything with dates I'm completely unreliable on, but they were, I think no one knew what to do with them after the World's Fair, so they were just in a warehouse, and it was really due to Herman Wells and also someone on the art faculty of the University of Indiana, whose name I've now forgotten, who basically lobbied to get them moved to the University of Indiana.
And it was March 1941 is when it was dedicated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's quite a few years after. That's 8 years after the murals were finished.
First of all, thank you very much. Illuminating and well documented. My question is, although Jackson Pollock obviously is indebted to Benton in so many ways, and the popular lore about Pollock is that their relationship was contentious. Benton outlives Pollock by 20 years. I wonder if he had anything to say about Pollock or abstract expressionism or what.
Yeah, I actually wrote a whole book about that called Tom and Jack, The Intertwined Lives of Thomas Hart Benton and Jackson Pollock. And it's a complicated story because it's clear that Benton and his wife, Rita, were really father and mother figures to Jackson Pollock, with a certain amount of Oedipal conflict there because Jackson Pollock had a great crush on Rita Benton, who was a quite beautiful Italian woman. One of there were two things that inspired me to write the book. One is that when I was doing a film with Ken Burns, all of the friends and students of Thomas Hart Benton who knew him in the period when Jackson Pollock was still alive remembered Jackson Pollock's late night phone calls to the Benton home. So it's clear that this was a relationship that, far from being a brief episode in Pollock's life, this was something that continued throughout his life. And these phone calls continued until a week or so before Jackson Pollock's death. The other thing that inspired me to write the book is when I was a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art, my son Tommy took an art class there, and he was 4 years old, meaning just 4 years old, and just beginning to talk. And he announced that he wanted to take me on a tour of the museum. And naturally, I thought this was sort of amusing and fascinating. The tour consisted of walking by everything, looking neither to left nor right, till he came in front of a painting by Jackson Pollock, and he said, "Dad, I like this one." And it intrigued me that there's something about Jackson Pollock's paintings that struck my 4-year-old son as not only the best painting in the museum, but essentially the only painting in the museum that was exciting to look at. And the other is that while I was looking at it with him, I asked myself, what does this look like to a 3-year-old? And the traditional idea about Jackson Pollock is that his paintings are flat because they're made out of paint. And in fact, in this example, if you look at it, it's not flat at all. It has a surging depth to it. In fact, it makes you a little bit seasick to look at it. And it struck me that that's exactly what Thomas Hart Benton's works do. And so I basically, with that incentive, wrote the book. But it's quite a fascinating story, both because of the dynamic between those two figures and also because it's sort of a view of the world of modern art in some ways through the wrong end of the telescope, but from Gertrude Stein's Paris to the regionalist movement to the work of the abstract expressionists. So if you want to know more, and that's a book which I think is pretty good beach or airplane reading. And both Benton and Pollock were hard drinking, rather pugnacious figures. So it makes a colorful story. Why don't we show the short video?
Dazzling. That's the word for Jackson Pollock's painting titled Mural. In the view of many scholars, it's the painting that established Pollock as the world's leading modern painter. But does the painting hold a secret? That's what I discovered while I was writing a new book on Jackson Pollock titled Tom and Jack, which explores Pollock's relationship with his teacher, Thomas Hart Benton. Pollock had wanted to make a great mural since he first arrived in New York in 1930 and posed for Thomas Hart Benton's great mural, America Today. But he didn't get a chance to make one until 1943, when the wealthy art collector Peggy Guggenheim commissioned him to paint a mural for the entrance hall of her New York apartment. In 1948, when she moved to Venice, Italy, she gave the painting to the University of Iowa, after Yale University turned it down. Fortunately, it survived a recent flood at the University of Iowa, which pretty much destroyed the museum. Today, it's valued at over $150 million, which is more than the average American earns in 5,000 years. The design of Pollock's mural follows principles that Benton published in 1926 in an article on abstract composition. The forms move around vertical poles. But how did Pollock organize his shapes?
When I saw these letters, it was truly an aha moment. It wasn't something that I was fishing for. I saw the kind of thing that you see when you're reading. You see a letter, then you see a space, letter and a space. When I took a look at this thing upside down, I saw the S-O-N pop out at me. Then I saw the P and Pollock, the capital P. The big tall L's that really almost bisect the painting are in the center as sort of an anchor. The S has this marvelous flourish. You have flourishes on the J, you have flourishes on the P's. And once I saw it, I can't not see it anymore.
Animals have been using camouflage for millions of years. That's how a poisonous copperhead snake disappears in autumn leaves. But the principles of camouflage weren't clearly understood until 1909, when they were analyzed by an American painter, Abbott Thayer. Thayer's discoveries were soon turned to military purposes. In World War I, Pollock's teacher, Thomas Hart Benton, and many other American artists worked with camouflage. Today, it's often used for military garb. And even Andy Warhol played with camouflage in a series of late self-portraits. What's odd about camouflage is that faint patterns stand out from their background and strong patterns disappear. For example, it's a zebra's stripes that will make it disappear into the background. If it didn't have stripes, you could see it clearly. Jackson Pollock's painting is so dazzling that it's hard to make out the letters all at once. You need to visually trace them one by one. Pollock once told a friend that he didn't have the technical ability to make a great realistic mural like Benton and needed to do something different. I think that by making the name Jackson Pollock so central to the design, he was announcing that he was replacing Thomas Hart Benton as the greatest American painter. I guess that was Pollock's way of making a name for himself.
With that video, we're just out of time, but just want to give another round of applause for Professor Henry Adams. Great presentation. And if the Indiana murals piqued your interest at all, feel free to come on by in Bloomington between 12 to 5 and check out the Mid-Century Modern tour. All right, thank you, everyone.